The Congress of South African Trade Unions, Cosatu, will this week embark on a national strike as labour disputes with government remain unresolved. Cosatu says government has failed to honour its wage agreement and to provide basic services on transport and healthcare. A no work, no pay principle will apply to those participating in the nationwide strike. This will mean that workers have to look for alternative ways of surviving should the strike drag on. Joining us now to unpack the implications of going on strike for workers is Tony Healy, who is a labour consultant, as well as Trenton, Elsley, director at the Labour Research Service. A very good afternoon to both of you, gentlemen. Perhaps let's start with you, Mr. Healy. It looks right now that there seem to be few options for the unions, or are there really?
Well, good afternoon. I think the dilemma that organised labour is faced with is that, first of all, they've lost a large number of members due to the large-scale retrenchments due to COVID, and we've been seeing a relatively steady decline in union membership in any event for some time. So I think that as the membership weakens, or lessens rather, then it will present greater difficulties and challenges for labour when it comes to them seeking to exercise their influence in regards socio-economic issues and collective bargaining in general.
Now, Trenton, what options are there really for workers at a time like this?
Well, I think it's really tough out there, and I think what the unions are doing, and there is a remarkably unified front on this. Most of the sort of national federations are in on this action. And I think what they're doing is they're highlighting issues that they believe to be key to workers and to the country, and creating pressure for policymakers to act on those issues. Because worker voices by themselves are very small.
And will we actually see the policymakers working on these issues? We've had discussions that have been long-going, ongoing, and there really seem to be no resolutions. There have been several meetings, and we could see the intention of the unions wanting to get some sort of agreement down that will avert a possible strike. But due to a lack of this being forthcoming, they find themselves in this position where this is ongoing. What is it going to take for there to be policy changes? What is it going to take for unions to feel like they are being taken seriously?
Tommy, I don't know if that's directed at me. Apologies if it isn't, but perhaps a couple of points. I think the fact of the matter is that no matter how laudable the agenda items may be regarding the socio-economic protest action type stayaways are, they really do, and history shows this, they really do have a limited capacity to influence government to make meaningful changes in the direction that organisation would like meaningful changes to be made. I think many around the country would support a lot of what is behind the 7 October protest action. That said, I really don't think, unfortunately, that action of this nature has the capacity to necessarily materially influence government to make the kind of changes that are being motivated by this kind of action.
So, Trenton, based on this and the fact that there's been very little progress from the government side, what other recourses do unions have, do workers have, to be taken seriously? And I think in answering this, let's also consider the current economic climate that we're in, the fact that we've just shed 2.2 million jobs in a period of just a few months.
Well, I think these, like so many things in life, there's not a clear causal link you can always make between, for instance, this or another general strike, or any type of action you might want to point to. It's not always that one has clear causal relationships. We did this and then that happened. But I think it's an important contribution to the context. And creating pressure and highlighting issues and raising the profile of issues is an important part of the broader political process. And I think it's fair to point out that unions in particular have been responding to the current context, which is a very particular one, although there are aspects of it that are not that new. But they've been responding in many ways. You know, they I think were quite involved in the implementation of the TER schemes. They're dealing with a lot of Section 189 retrenchment proceedings, essentially involved in business rescue exercises. They're very active in health and safety in the workplace, which has been a really important issue this year. And also, I think, a role player in sort of the various COVID levels and their implementation. So responding in a lot of different ways. It's not like this is the sum total of their participation. So, you know, it's just, I think, one more action as part of a broader program of action, trying to influence policy and trying to give voice to workers who are also under extreme pressure, many of them, which I don't think is contentious.
Tony, what we saw as well, especially this afternoon, early on when Cosatu was giving their briefing, is that they've added other social issues onto their agenda, issues of gender-based violence and the endangerment of children. They've spoken as well about corruption and added that onto the agenda of what they're going to be marching against. Just your thoughts on this and the value that this will add to their cause.
Well, look, I think there are many of us around the country that would support all of those agenda items. They're all very important, and they're all issues that government needs to come to terms with and make meaningful policy changes and other decisions to address exactly those things. That said, yes, protest action of this nature will kind of elevate these agenda items into the consciousness of many around the country and government itself. The fact of the matter is, though, that Cosatu for itself, as an example, is a very, very different to Cosatu to 10, 15, 20 years ago. It really doesn't have the same influence. They would suggest to you that they do, as would SAFTU, a splinter federation, but they really don't. And I think that if you look back at things like the toll roads, for example, and the extent to which Cosatu raised that particular agenda item, again, as laudable as it may be, it really made no difference whatsoever ultimately to policy on toll roads in Gauteng. So, and I think a final point that has to be made is that one needs to draw a distinction between organized labor in the private sector and the public sector. So whilst there is a relatively high union density within the public sector, that's not the case in the private sector. It's much, much lower. And I think it would be hard to deny, notwithstanding the relevance of organized labor in the workplace, that the influence over recent years has waned.
And picking up on that point that you've made, Trenton, if you could just comment on this. Do you think that it's time that unions somewhat, if they can, depoliticize themselves? We know that unions are very strongly affiliated, to political parties. But when it comes to times such as this, when they're trying to get buy-in from the very parties that they're supporting and not getting that, would they be more efficient? Would they have more bargaining power if they were actually outside of those structures?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I would point out that this particular action on the 7th is a remarkably united front. As we talk about the politicization of issues, perhaps, in unions, Cosatu, as we know, is in the alliance. However, the likes of Fiducia and SAFTU are not. And they're also part of this broader action on the 7th. So I don't think it's just a question of politicization. The second part of your question, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Are you saying that the unions would be better served by, I don't know, not striking?
No, here's what I'm asking, and I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned Cosatu. Would they be more effective if they were not affiliated to any political party, for example?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a heavily debated question, and not really for me to decide. This comes out of, I suppose many people don't perhaps understand trade union structures as they go from sort of a shop floor level and work their way up, for instance, to the level of a national federation. But, these are resolutions and policies of worker organizations, and, they've made these decisions. Cosatu has made its, Fiducia, up to others have made theirs. So, I mean, it's a perennial question to be closer or further away from the levers of power. It's not really for me to pronounce on that here. I think as long as a national federation retains its autonomy, that's what interests me, is an independent democratic trade union. And I believe that Cosatu still ticks those boxes.
And let's close off with you, Tony. It's not business as usual in South Africa right now, in fact, in the entire world, with economic recovery being top of the agenda. What impact do you believe that this strike action will actually have on the efforts of economic recovery in South Africa, if at all?
Well, I think, and unfortunately, the short answer to that is none. In these are absolutely very different times to what we've experienced before. These are extraordinary times. And I don't think organizations that organize labor has understood that. We're seeing the old tried and tested. We're hearing the old rhetoric, the old style of collective bargaining, the old style of protest action, as if it's business as usual. It's not business as usual. And I think that as laudable as all of these agenda items are, when labor kind of does their tarmac shuffles around all the CBDs on the 7th, there are, I would have thought, there are more critical grassroots shop floor issues that should be focused on. And that's not to say that labor should organize should ignore broader societal issues. They have a role to play in that. But in these extraordinary times when workers at a shop floor grassroots level are so vulnerable, I would have thought that if labor was going to spend an extraordinary amount of time on anything, it would be on precisely that: job creation, job preservation.
Well, gentlemen, we'll leave it at that for this afternoon. A really pertinent conversation on unions, strike action, and the way forward. How does one strike that balance between securing workers' rights, but also ensuring that the economy in the process does not suffer? Thank you very much for your time. That's Tony Healy there, Labour Consultant, as well as Trenton, Elsley, Director at the Labour Research Services.